Thank you all so much for joining today's panel. It's been such an amazing opportunity to get to meet you all and be a part of this amazing team here at IREC and working on these really important issues. And today, we have this really exciting panel that we're going to be discussing again this intersection between energy equity and interconnection. Right, a very novel approach, something very new to this space, and something we're really excited about because we think that interconnection can really be a change maker and an agent for change in this process. So again, my name is Shay Banton. I use they, them pronouns, and I've been with IREC for about a year as a regulatory program engineer and energy justice policy advocate. And again, I'm honored to be here with these amazing panelists. Before we get started, just setting some groundwork, just defining energy equity for those who may be a little bit unfamiliar with it. So the goal of energy equity is to achieve equity in both the social and economic participation in the energy system, while also remediating any past harms that energy system has caused to different communities. And this ultimately, and makes sense, it ultimately centers the voices, or requires the centering of voices and concerns of frontline working class and BIPOC communities throughout the development, implementation, and enforcement of energy policies and regulations. And we also need to keep in context as we think about these principles of energy equity that DERs in and of themselves, like access to DERs, is not just access to clean energy or fighting climate change. It's increased reliability. It's enabling resiliency to a more volatile climate, especially for those who are medically vulnerable. There's a lot of dynamicism and a lot of things considered in the incorporation and access and increasing access to clean energy resources. So we want to make sure we keep that in context as we discuss interconnection in this context. So. And we also believe, as we said, that interconnection could be a positive agent for change for sorry, I'm a little flustered. I'm going to take a brief second. I don't know why. Okay, let me start over. However, while interconnection is primarily viewed as only a barrier, we at IREC believe that equity-centered interconnection policies can play a positive role in expediting access to clean energy resources for communities in need. So with that being said, I'm going to introduce our amazing panelists here. First up, we have, I'm not going to go in order here because I have it on my list. First up, we have Adrian Davis, who is co-founder and managing member at Prime Partners Engineering, a full-service project management, engineering design, and solar consultation firm headquartered in DC. Thanks so much for joining, Adrian.
Thank you.
Next up, we have Katie Keinbaum, a senior researcher at the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, which works to build strong local economies by challenging concentrated corporate power. Her recent work includes research into the benefits of local clean energy ownership, the barriers facing local solar deployment, and the ways that federal policies can increase access to rooftop and community solar. Happy to have you here, Katie. And then we have on the monitor up there, Stephen, out in sunny Hawaii. He is a utility analyst with the Office of Policy and Research at the Hawaii Public Utility Commission. And his work focuses on renewable acquisition, interconnection of utility scale and community solar resources, and integrated grid planning. Excited to have you here, Stephen. We also are joined by Radina. You've seen her a few times a day. She is incredible, my hero, and Vice President of the Regulatory Program here at IREC and a leading expert in energy and climate policy, as well as focusing in electric and gas utility sectors, utility transformation, and enabling a just transition to a more decarbonized economy. And finally, we have Nathan Phelps, right here to my left, who is the managing director of the Regulatory Advocacy Hub at Volt Solar, which is dedicated to advancing regulatory excellence and inclusion in venues across the country. And thanks so much for joining. Can I get a quick round of applause for our panelists real quick? Thank you so much. Awesome. So let's go ahead and dive into the questions. So first and foremost, we're going to start with you, Nathan. For those who weren't with us yesterday, I represented and held a training on interconnection. And one of the training modules is focused on this intersection, identifying interconnection equity, and then identifying various solutions to solving for the inequities in the system. And thank you all so much for participating who did. And it came out of the work that our team, IREC, and Both Solar led this year in co-facilitating a access and equity advisory committee, a group of experts of color that came together to really investigate various energy policy issues. And this year they did interconnection. It was a really great process. And so I'd love to hear from you, Nathan, first, since you're close to the subject already. How would you, in your opinion, what role does interconnection play in the just transition? How would you define interconnection equity? And do you have any examples of currently overlooked aspects of energy equity in interconnection regulation?
Thank you, Shay. You're really starting with the softball there. So I would say to start, really, interconnection equity is making sure that everyone, regardless of their location, economic background, race, has the ability to participate in the clean energy economy. It sounds pretty simple, right? Well, it's not, because fundamentally, we don't all live with the same distribution system. We may think about that as being uniform, but it's not. We have communities that have very old infrastructure and communities that have very new infrastructure, communities that have different hosting capacity, not based on what has already been interconnected, but based on just the historic aspects of the grid. So we're already starting from a point where not everyone has the ability to interconnect in the same way to the grid. We're seeing some really interesting work in the Midwest here. I think the Midwest is really at the forefront of evaluating this. Brad talked about this a little bit earlier. Brad, you stole some of my talking points. Not cool. So, but we're seeing in the Midwest here really overlaying different geographic data about reliability, socioeconomic characteristics, and starting to learn more that yes, there are differences based on income and race. And that leads to a very disproportionate opportunity for participating in the clean energy economy. And it's not just individuals here, it's also communities. So if we think about an individual, the individuals in disadvantaged communities may not have the ability to participate as as much. But solar is a very social technology, and it kind of spreads within communities. And so when we have communities that are left behind as far as installation goes, we also have communities that start to be left behind in participation in the clean energy economy. The economic opportunities, the jobs, and all of that is not strictly related to interconnection. I want to be clear, this is a multifaceted, very dynamic issue, but interconnection is one of those pieces. It's, I think, a piece that we can really account for.
Thank you so much, Nathan. Passing the mic over to you, Katie. I know you've done a lot of research on local solar deployment barriers, and so posing the same question to you. Again, that is, how would you define the concept of interconnection equity, and what important aspects have you seen overlooked in energy regulation?
Thanks, Shay. And I think, I mean, Nathan, you gave a really good overview, I think, of the what interconnection equity is. I'll maybe just add to that that it's not only making sure that projects are able to connect to the grid and have equitable access to that, but it's also that these communities are also involved in regulatory proceedings on the issue and decision making around how interconnection works. But I think to focus more on that last piece of the question of things that maybe are a little overlooked or not recognized as much, um, I guess my answer is I don't think what I'm about to say is necessarily exactly overlooked, but I wanted to highlight a specific context of how it relates to equity, in that the importance of having, as was mentioned earlier today, having really good quality, publicly available data is really essential to be able to identify where these interconnection inequities already exist and to be able to have the ability to really hold utilities and regulators accountable for addressing those disparities. So, by this, I'm talking about things like grid hosting capacity analyses and looking at that as compared to demographic information, doing a geographic analysis there. I'm talking about interconnection timelines, grid upgrade costs, all that kind of information, because we need that information to be able to provide some level of public oversight of how interconnection procedures are working in communities. And that's really important if we think about how uh, investor owned utility monopolies aren't always necessarily very incentivized to make sure that the interconnection process is as fast, is as affordable, and is as easy really for these distributed energy projects as is possible. I was uh, a couple years ago doing a project on some of these barriers to local solar deployment development, and I spoke with a community solar developer who told me that in his experience, interconnection wasn't necessarily their biggest barrier or their biggest problem overall, but it was the area where they saw the most blatant noncompliance from utilities. And so this is, of course, something that can affect all DER projects, not just projects that are, located in or led by underinvested communities, but these community-based projects typically have fewer resources, both on like the technical and the financial side, to really be able to pull apart those threads and figure out, what's really happening behind the scenes. Is what they're telling me correct? Is, maybe it's not. Are they able to go faster, and just to have that real insight and ability to push on things? So that's kind of one piece that I think is recognized, but I'm not sure if that aspect of it is always fully touched on in terms of what it means for equity as well.
Thank you, Katie. So what I heard there was increased transparency and data granularity to better address and understand the components of energy equity as it distributed across the circuit and across the system, as well as actually, yeah, I'll pause there and I'll see if there's any thoughts on are there any concerns or challenges with collecting and aggregating data on equity related metrics? Does anyone have any comments or thoughts on that type of subject? I'm wondering, Stephen, to you as well. I know you've done a lot of that work with Hawaii Public Utility Commission. Are there any challenges with collecting equity related data and distributing across the circuit to understand where lack of reliability is between certain communities or not?
Thanks, Shay. Yeah, I think part of the issue is maybe just the siloed nature. The PUC regulates Hawaiian Electric, which is the investor-owned utility that operates 5 separate grids on the different islands in Hawaii, with the exception of Kauai. But yeah, it's definitely the siloed nature that the planning process happens. So trying to put those pieces together, and I'll talk more about it later in the panel. But the equity docket that we've recently opened is to try and collect that data, but then you have to translate the findings into the hosting capacity studies and into the planning studies that are happening. So that coordination can be difficult when there's a lot of priorities on the utilities plate.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Stephen. Any other thoughts there? Cool. So I want to also pass that same question about some of the initial ideas about energy equity and interconnection from IREC's perspective. If Regina, if you could share a little bit about that.
Sure, thank you. And I do want to note our panelist today, Melanie Santiago Moser, was not able to join us. I am here in her place due to an emergency. I am a poor substitute for Melanie. For anyone who knows her, you know that is the truth. She's absolutely wonderful. We miss her very much. So I think the way that we're trying to view the question of interconnection equity isn't in isolation. First, I should note that, as Shay mentioned, this is a rather new concept. If you go into an interconnection docket right now in most states, or have over the past 20 years, energy equity is probably not a subject that has come up. So part of it is just getting the dialogue started with Vote Solar's amazing team as well, to have these conversations very intentionally. And in some cases, that's as basic as, well, I shouldn't, basic in the term of simple. It's as simple as making the case to regulators and utilities and other stakeholders that there is a link between interconnection and energy equity. That's not always obvious. Sometimes it does take some education and some talking around what that link is. So I think that's part of the foundational work that we're trying to build. And I think the other piece of it, also foundational, is something that's come up a couple of times today. Brad mentioned it on our last panel, Chair Christian did as well, excuse me, that concept of what is the meaning of just and reasonable rates in the age of climate change. what is the meaning of the just and reasonable standard when our goal is a just transition? How does that standard need to change in order to make energy equity a core component of the evaluation of prudence review, of just and reasonable, of public interest, so that it's not just an, oh yes, and let's consider equity, so that it's a core part of basic utility regulation, and that goes beyond just an interconnection. So creating that dialogue, creating an awareness that there is a link between energy equity and interconnection, and starting to get it more integrated into conversations.
Absolutely. You can definitely talk a little bit more about how we go about actually making that structural foundational change, very much what Sky was referencing earlier as well. And to a previous point that you mentioned, Nathan, you mentioned the disparate grid infrastructure between certain communities. So let's dive a little bit deeper into some of the details about inequities that are actually impacting various communities that want to participate. So I'll direct this question first to you, Adrian. So as a project development consultant, how have you experienced interconnection inequities in your work or have been informed of them by stakeholders you work with? And two, how did those inequities impact your or their experiences in the interconnection process?
Yeah, thank you, Shay. So I guess I would start with, and I know it's been mentioned several times today, around the disproportionate updating of the infrastructure in those LMI and underserved communities, right? I think that's a major challenge. And Ramona, to your point, right? I know equity isn't necessarily a newer term, right? But these challenges have been around for years for utilities and for these communities as well. I think that's one, Shay, and then another term everybody's been talking about is financing. I know there's a lot of financing out there, but making sure that that financing gets to the right people at the right time is going to benefit these communities. And I think it has a lot to do with not only making sure there's good actors, but also making sure that the actors are trustworthy and are there to create short-term and long-term benefit for those communities.
Thanks, Adrian. And to you, Stephen, I know you and the HPUC have done an incredible job, trying to reach those communities and learn their perspectives. How have you gone about that, and what have you learned through those engagement sessions?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we've definitely learned that the inequities there's a lot of different categories. So some of them have already been shared today. There's the high cost of interconnection. Hawaii, given its landscape, does have comparatively higher interconnection costs, and those pass through to the ratepayers and increase the energy burden in terms of affordability for our low to moderate income customers. The complexity of the interconnection process also has disparate impact on who's participating. So, as was already said, the community solar developers, the smaller developers, tend to be less resourced. So their ability to interact with the utility and go through these processes can really create a lot of barriers. And so at the PUC, we think about, when we make policies for the interconnection process, we have to think about whether it's creating more upfront cost or just general barriers to the process. I can talk a little bit more later, but we've tried to bring on independent entities to help liaise developers through the processes, and that's been really successful as well. And I think the one other one I'll mention is for the siting of projects. There's communities in Hawaii that have historically hosted a greater share of the energy projects, and those communities have also historically not been had a voice in where those projects are being sited. So we do have these multi-pronged priorities for introducing community voice into the process earlier, definitely to deal with that siting issue as well.
Thanks so much, Stephen. So I heard, just to kind of summarize what we've heard a lot today, we heard a lot about the disparate grid infrastructure that's from Nathan. We heard about differentials in expertise and resources from Stephen and from Adrian. And are there any other aspects or issues or challenges that certain communities or inexperienced communities may face when trying to work into or operate in the interconnection process that anyone else would like to highlight?
I mean, I would just highlight, and I've heard it today, it's like when you submit your application, or just the application process for interconnection is like a black hole, right? And so, I used to work for Pepco, right? And I joke to the developers that Pepco is a black hole, right? But I think it's kind of true in that the interconnection process it's really confusing, right? And then you think about a lot of these LMI communities; these are one-time developers or communities that are putting an application. These aren't the larger, the SunPowers, right? The larger developers that have put in applications for years that kind of can work through the nuances and have the resources to do so. And so, you know, who helps them go through the interconnection process? Who explains it to them, right? Who walks them through from start to finish? And also the planning portion of that is important.
Absolutely. And Katie?
Yeah, I just want to add on to what Adrian was saying. When I've spoken with developers before, sometimes they've said, "Oh, we just find like our person at that utility, and we like know who to like. We just figure out who to go to actually figure out like why something's stuck, why something's not moving, how to unstick it." But if this is your only project that you've ever worked on before, you don't have that connection. Um, I also spoke to one developer who said they don't know this for sure, but one CNI project they were working on just was in that black hole. They didn't know what was happening, like why it was stuck in the interconnection process. But the person they were doing the project for played golf with someone who was high up at the utility, and then suddenly it was fine. So there's sometimes, and this isn't, that's not always the case for what the problem is, but having that like expertise built up, or even just those connections to be able to talk to the right person to unstick something, if there isn't a really transparent process, that's very harmful for communities.
Absolutely, Nathan.
So I sometimes joke, and I'm about to run the risk of upsetting the engineers in the room, but I sometimes joke that interconnection is perceived as engineers arguing with engineers about engineering stuff. And that kind of loses the human aspect of all of this too. And if we step back for a second and think about it, and Stephen mentioned it, there's an issue with just the development of the process. Stephen, I apologize, but I'll characterize this as procedural justice issue with just establishing the rules. And then if we think about the actual tariffs themselves, they're not fun to read. They're not easy to read. They're not accommodating to the general populace. So if we think about people that do not have the expertise, do we really have an expectation that they can participate on their own? How well can they help change the process if they're inherently if they're coming across language that is kind of exclusionary for them? So there's roadblocks along the way to the communities that are most vulnerable actually participating and benefiting from the process.
Absolutely, absolutely. I know you've brought up it before, even just translation services, right? That accessibility barrier, whether it's, yeah. So there's a lot of challenges that are limiting both procedural justice in the policy development process, as well as the actual project development process, as you noted over there as well. Really, really appreciate that feedback. So, I mean, now that we kind of identified some of those challenges in the procedural realm, do we have ideas, or has anyone come across solutions for enhancing or enabling greater procedural justice, either in the policy development or in the project development processes?
I can speak briefly on the policy development process. I think some states, thinking particularly New York, Illinois, and California, have adopted some, um, in some instances, some good procedural justice initiatives. For example, if there's a public hearing on a potential commission order on an issue, they've begun to ask questions. Where is that hearing being held? Is it being made accessible in terms of both the location and the time? Is it during the time when most people are working and they're not able to go even if they wanted to? So just removing basic participation barriers that you would think are basic but have been missing from, or rather the solutions for them have been missing from the way that we regulate the sector for a very, very long time. So
Absolutely, absolutely. Nathan?
I think if we look at FERC, and I don't necessarily think we should look at FERC for good examples on a lot of stuff, but the Office of Public Participation, I think, is a good example of a regulator thinking and deciding, well, it really goes back to the 70s. Anyway, FERC looking at the Office of Public Participation as this is something we need in order to open up the conversation with people that are not participating in the process. And we've seen some states actually embrace that too. So Connecticut, the Connecticut regulator, also has a similar entity as the Office of Public Participation to try to actually engage with the general populace on how to participate at the PUC.
Absolutely. And I may deviate a little bit just briefly. I just like am interested. So yesterday in our training we discussed the various potential groups that are experiencing are essentially disadvantaged in these processes, right? We identified three main buckets. So disadvantage, referencing so individuals who just haven't been reached out to, are not engaged, or constantly overlooked in the regulatory process. We talked about disinvested. That's getting at the grid infrastructure challenge. That grid infrastructure is not equitably distributed across the system, and so some communities may be not receiving that. And then we had remember disinvested, and I'm just wondering, does anyone in the audience have any suggestions for what other types of communities need to be reached out to that we aren't really considering, and our panelists as well, that we aren't considering in interconnection equity, in regulatory proceedings around energy at all? It was just a shot in the dark. I'm just like, it's, yeah, definitely looking. Oh, go ahead.
I'll give you something to work off of here. I mean, like, usually the people that are getting involved in this, like, interconnection isn't something people just go to the bar and talk about on like a Thursday night. Like, this is, something.
You're hanging out with the wrong people.
Well, yeah, maybe this crowd, that's what y'all are going to be doing tonight. But it's people usually, if they aren't in this field, aren't working on this issue. Maybe they only know about it once they run into a problem, or once they're actually like involved in a clean energy project, a DER project. So communities that don't have a lot of DR deployment or penetration, they aren't really necessarily always like proactively brought into the process. And of course, Nathan raised that, it's hard to, like, you can't just expect people who aren't familiar with this to be able to engage at the levels that it's discussed about. But yeah, that's kind of the the like potentially future interconnection customers are like one category of folks that probably encompasses some of the others that you've already mentioned that aren't typically involved in these kinds of discussions or proceedings.
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you all for
Shay,
taking that journey with me.
could I add
Oh,
one
go
more?
ahead, Steve. Yes, absolutely.
Thanks, Shay. I would just add one maybe nuance to the disadvantaged communities where there have been a lot of efforts in Hawaii to reach out to communities. So there's a lot of different entities that are doing that, whether it's the commission or the state energy office or the utility. And I think there's a lot of interest from the communities in participating. So they have been reached out to, but it's also the accessibility to the information that's being talked about. So making our planning discussions and interconnection discussions more accessible from just being able to talk about the topics. There was a Good Volts podcast this week talking about how the energy industry is largely run by wonks, which just makes it really difficult for people outside of this industry to understand. So I think it's really important to be able to, bring the topics out there in a way that people can understand so they engage, because there is an interest in engaging.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Stephen. And I'm actually going to turn it right back to you because I'd love to hear you expand a little bit more on. I know you had that amazing equity proceeding. If you could tell us a little bit about it and how you're trying to address a lot of these. It sounds like you're already addressing a lot of the procedural elements. What other elements are you addressing in that equity proceeding?
Yeah, so the energy equity proceeding is fairly new, and I would say it's just getting off the ground, but it has laid out, 5 principal areas that it's looking to work, and there's a work plan that's published that I can share around. But so the 5 key issues are procedural equity, as already been mentioned, energy affordability and payment assistance, equitable project siting, equitable access to clean energy, and then utility performance and tracking. So that's sort of the groundwork that's been laid so far, and you know, those different work streams are going to have a subset of working groups and other activities kind of to start later this year. But there has been an interest recently just because we have a procurement that's in the near term. So there has been a work stream started up that is tackling interconnection issues and procurement issues. And so we've started a series of 4 working groups. The first one was really focused on education and just sort of laying the groundwork for how do the procurements work, what are the issues, and the next one is going to start to source some solutions from the community on how they want to have their voices heard in the process. If they're familiar, sort of what have they identified as historical issues. And we're really trying at the commission to find this balance between um, not slowing down the process that we have, because we have some aggressive targets that we're trying to meet, but really incorporate this feedback early so that it doesn't potentially delay the process later. And I think, Shay, you have some questions on this, so I might not jump into that topic. But anyways, that's a broad picture of this energy equity proceeding, and we'd be happy to talk about it more. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Stephen. Yeah, it's really great. Highly recommend checking out the Equity Proceeding and all the work that Hawaii PUC has done in supporting the various communities, in assisting them both in the technical, procedural aspects, as well as some of the financial aspects of interconnection. They're really challenging. Passing the question over to you, Radina, if you're okay. Taking a stab at what additional assistance can utility commissions, utilities themselves, or stakeholders like us really do to support communities in operating an interconnection?
Sure. Well, if I may, I'd like to share some of the solutions that we discussed yesterday and that we've been talking about with Vote Solar, the Access and Equity Advisory Committee, and other stakeholders around interconnection equity. So, like, really digging in on interconnection. Um, as a starting point, I really want to emphasize, kind of like we were talking about earlier, Sky. I think you mentioned there's a difference between talking about integrated distribution planning, which impacts interconnection, versus what goes into the interconnection procedures themselves. So part of the work that we've been doing is identifying what is within the procedures themselves, like what goes into an interconnection tariff that impacts energy equity. So getting really, really specific. And for example, one of the issues that has arisen, probably not surprising, is the cost of grid upgrades. That can be a barrier to any project. However, for projects that are serving disadvantaged communities, and I'm using that term just because it's very commonly used in state and federal law, for projects serving disadvantaged communities, for community solar, let's say, they may already be facing upfront financing barriers, and adding the cost of major grid upgrades to that can simply exacerbate existing barriers. And so finding a way to alleviate those costs in the near term through things like innovative cost sharing mechanisms, maybe rate basing a portion of those upgrade costs could be one solution. Making sure that equity is centered not just within interconnection, but within integrated distribution planning, as we've already talked about quite a bit today, in terms of looking at where is the grid not as updated as it should be compared to the overall utility service territory, in order to reduce barriers to DER adoption. And then potentially engineering support. This is something that I think we're still trying to figure out. It's a bit of a chicken and egg question. Are we not seeing more community built community energy projects because there's no interest in them? Or are we not seeing them because the barriers are so high that they're simply not happening? And so I think this is a question that we're going to attempt to answer. And if the answer is there is a desire for community, and when I say community driven, I mean the community takes the primary initiative on developing a local clean energy project without the assistance of a developer. In that instance, having engineering support for the pre-application process, for the application process, for the study and screening process could be very helpful as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I think we've really started touching already on this idea that traditional approaches to addressing interconnection inequities or interconnection challenges have been reactive in nature versus a more proactive approach, which is getting into that integrated distribution planning conversation. But I'd still like to open up that conversation because I still think it's a really important question to deviate to investigate further, and that is how would a more proactive approach to holistic system planning help alleviate some of the barriers that we discussed today on interconnection inequity? And that's an open question to all stakeholders.
All right, I'll go first. I think the first is just transparency. That's been brought up multiple times today, but we actually don't have enough information about characteristics of the grid right now. So, and once again, I mentioned this earlier, but the Midwest is kind of at the forefront of looking at this about the existing grid infrastructure. How is that impacting the reliability? And this is the issues that Brad brought up earlier. How is it impacting power quality and the socioeconomic layered over that? And then the next step after that is lay the hosting capacity over that. We need more information before we can actually reach conclusions about what is the current status quo, if you will.
Absolutely, absolutely. Data transparency is such an important component. Data granularity is such an incredibly important concept. I know we've heard from a lot of stakeholders in our own groups that it's difficult to achieve or obtain a lot of that really highly granular data, and that data is necessary to inform that more proactive development. Any other comments on that?
Just one, I think it goes back to that question of what is the standard we apply to overall utility regulation. And so when I think about traditional affordability programs for low-income utility customers, those might be developed in their own separate docket, and you're really asking, how can we provide immediate bill assistance? But affordability goes to so much more than that. Distributed energy resources can be an affordability resource, and if interconnection is posing a barrier to that, then interconnection suddenly could become an affordability tool in a sort of more distanced way. It's not direct, but it's part of that bigger picture. So I think taking a more holistic view of, so I guess putting my regulator advisory hat on, if I was talking to a commission, I would say take a holistic view at what affordability means to you in your state, to what energy equity means to you in your state, and how each of the various components that impact affordability fit together, including interconnection, including distribution system planning, including net metering and everything else. So don't view them in isolation.
Absolutely, absolutely. Seeing if there's, yeah, let's move on to the next question. Is that okay? So this one is a little bit provocative, so just FYI. So the leading in the opposite way. So hopefully it's okay. It is now commonly understood that there is sometimes a conflict and tension between the expediency required to reach our renewable energy targets and ensuring the transition is just and equitable. So how do you propose we operate between these objectives that may sometimes be at odds with one another, if they are?
Okay.
Yes. I'm so sorry. You would like me to repeat the question? Or are you good? Okay, I'll repeat the question. It is now commonly understood that there is a conflict/tension between the expediency required to reach our renewable energy targets and ensuring the transition is just and reasonable. How do you propose we operate between these objectives that may sometimes be at odds with one another?
I'll go. It was mentioned earlier that I actually do think it's a false dichotomy. So I want to say that first. But I do expect that we're going to be hearing this more and more frequently. So as we have more and more states committing to 100%, and the timeline starts to shrink about when we can do it, we're going to hear this more and more. But I think it's a false dichotomy because if we're going to actually achieve 100%, we're going to need participation of everyone. And if we don't work on the equity issues on the front end, we're going to be, pardon my language, screwed on the back end. So we have to do both now. It's not a matter of or, it's a matter of how do we do it together.
Collaboration. Beautiful.
Yeah, no, Shay, I would agree. I think they are at odds. Um, obviously these goals are really high goals, right? And I feel for the utilities, right? Because you need more resources to handle the increased applications. Um, but I would say, the kind of the squeaky wheel gets the oil type of analogy, where you have these major players getting all the attention, and so who's looking out for the little guy, right? Who's making sure that they are getting the attention that they need. And so, for example, we have a weekly meeting with Pepco around all the projects that we consult on for the developers, and so we work for about 10 developers in DC and Maryland, right? And so we're supporting them, but then, who's supporting the LMI communities who are trying to start their own projects, have no clue where to start. They, like you said, they don't have that point of contact at the utility. So I think it's critical that, somebody support them, but then also we need more resources in the utilities to handle the communication piece.
Absolutely, and I do want
Yeah,
to put you, Stephen, on. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to jump in. Yeah, I agree with what Nathan said because I think there, you know, a little bit of work on the front end, which is relative, I will say. It is a lot of work, but it saves even more time on the back end because, we've had projects end up in long appeals processes in the permitting agencies. They've even gone up to the Supreme Court. And once it gets there, there's no power that the regulator or the utility has to help a project. What they do have the power to do is try and you know, improve the processes, gather more community input on the front end so that you have more support for the project as it goes through all of its different steps to getting developed. So I do think that, yeah, that work up front really mitigates a huge risk that's on the back end, like Nathan said.
Absolutely. So what I'm hearing is that these may be at odds if done reactively versus proactive. If done proactively, it's going to expedite the process, but if done reactively, it's going to then be a much longer process. Any agreement there? Awesome. I am officially out of questions. So we only have a couple minutes left, and so I'd love to open up to Q&A. So if you would like to enter, we'll hear from people from the chat if you're on the virtually, but we'll turn up to Julieta first.
Yes. So I have a comment and I think it'll turn into a question, but I don't know if you guys remember in our panel, Brad repeated what Pearl said from Pepco Holdings to really understand what was the key, I think, limitation they had, which was to really understand how DERs at a more granular geographic level were going to happen so that they could make, I can't remember the regulatory term used, I'm on the engineering side, prudence, investments, blah, blah. And so, for example, in my company, we work with utilities, helping them do exactly this. And the data that we're using is socioeconomics, customer, adoption, right? And so back to the dichotomy that was just mentioned here, the opportunity that we're realizing is like the same data that we're using to know which customer is going to adopt is the same data that you need to identify equity issues. And so I wanted to see, because I think there's also, it's very important to do this right. If we do it wrong, our models right now show that rich and white people adopt. The data shows it. And we are running these models to predict where the investments are going to go. And so how do we take this chance of what this can show us, but not replicate any systemic injustices that might be actually with data-driven approaches?
Okay, so if I could put in my own words, is that we already recognize that affordability trends trend towards the rich, the white, the wealthier groups of people, and if those trends are continuing to show that, and we're using data-driven investment decisions, it's just going to continue to exacerbate those inequities, right? So how do we address that?
I don't think we're going to be able to address it in the next couple of minutes, but there's a few issues that we can try to identify. The first is we really need to change the regulatory paradigm. Specifically, what I mean by that is the criteria by which regulators evaluate issues. Equity should be embedded in every regulatory process right now, and it's not. Traditionally, regulators are looking at it from a purely economic perspective, and that needs to change. Used and useful when you're trying to do proactive investments doesn't work. So we need to change that. But we also need to identify the systemic inequities that are currently in the system so that we can proactively address those too. If we just build a renewable energy system based on the current thinking, we're just going to exacerbate existing inequities.
Absolutely. Okay. I see Midhat. I think you were up there first. Is that from the virtual?
Yeah. Yes, a question from virtual attendees. Is disinterested another category because of the lack of awareness or sense of agency?
Can you repeat that one more time?
Is disinterested another category because of the lack of awareness or sense of agency?
Interesting. I know they said disinterested. I think they may be disinvested. I'm going to see if anyone else under.
Yeah, if we can also add distrust to that, because think of the communities that have been harmed by the existing system, that have borne the emissions, all of the siting issues, the traditional environmental justice issues. What reason do we have to give those communities that they can trust us going forward? So yeah, I would say we have a serious problem to overcome there too.
Yeah, so it's the conflation, if I'm understanding. It's difficult to determine between disinterest in development and distrust of the system that is historically harmed. Yeah.
Hi, thanks. I'm Kyle Samajima with Minneapolis Climate Action, and we have been the outreach and engagement partner for the last 5 years with a local solar developer, Renewable Energy Partners. And I can say that the community engagement work, that we do about community solar, if we walked in and started with interconnection, I think people would not even come in the first place. I'm really saying that even just the work that we are doing with, first of all, paying people to participate, honoring their experience, time, and wisdom, giving them stipends when they share their experience and help us, work with us to shape our outreach, makes a huge difference. But I know that we can't start with these more complicated issues. And even as someone who's been in this field, granted more on the engagement side, and just in the last 6 months taking community solar development courses, coming to things like this, it's daunting. And it literally takes 5 touches with a community member, with first gaining the trust. I mean, I think one of our biggest strengths has been working with partners already in the communities. And again, it's really exciting to hear about interconnection and equity, because it has to come from every angle and direction. And I would love to hear your ideas and your thoughts about pulling together the community engagement that rarely gets the resources it needs. I cannot tell you how many times I have to raise my hand, whether it's grants, grant funding, whatever, to say, you cannot run a community solar garden with $10,000 in community engagement money. And I see that all the time. So thank you for letting me share all that information, but I'd love to hear ideas and vision for connecting that deep community engagement that has to happen over a long period of time and these more technical processes. Thanks.
Yeah, so I do want to jump in here. This actually came up yesterday during a training. One of the solutions was project development and engineering support. And I think, to your point, right, I think the term should be community development and engineering support, right? I think you can't, like to your point, you can't start with interconnection. These communities are having challenges with education, healthcare. You know, I've lived in communities that are food deserts, right? So the most menial challenges they're having, but you come in, the first thing you say is like, I want to put solar on your roof, right? So you got to start obviously with the more needed benefits in these communities, right, to get to interconnection. And then you definitely hit another major point, right? It's a long-term approach, right? We are partnering with you. We are not putting solar on your roof and then leaving, right? So thank you for that.
And I think this is one reason why, like, you know, not only in terms of interconnection, but, you know, broader capacity building support is needed for these community-led or driven or owned projects, because, you know, organizations that are pursuing that, whether they're focused specifically on clean energy or maybe on a whole host of community issues, do have some more of that, you know, already have some of that trust and that understanding of community needs and community resources. So that you know, aspect of, you know, we don't just want to be supporting community solar projects that are benefiting or subscribing low-income households, but also trying to make sure that there's that level of community ownership over projects as well.
Absolutely. And no other comments? Oh, Stephen?
Shay, if I could add, yeah. No, I was just thinking about, you know, the vision for that piece of procedural equity, which is also providing resources to the community, because I think, you know, in this paradigm, there's a lot of vested interest from the utility and the developers, but the community also deserves compensation and resources for the energy and time that they're putting in. So, yeah, I think as a plug for Hawaii, we have the performance-based rate making or regulation paradigm, and I think that allows for a lot of maybe innovative incentives that we can set up and potentially leverage those sort of that funding scheme that is not the traditional utility rate making procedure to allow for some of that compensation for communities to be involved.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now turn over to you, Brad.
Yeah, just a short comment. I wanted to make sure on this topic to plug the work of Dr. Gabe Chan, a professor here in Minneapolis at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs, who's written a paper called Regulating for Energy Justice, which I think co-authored that paper. I think folks who are interested in this topic should read that. Professor Chan has served as an expert witness in multiple states for community organizations that are fighting for energy justice, and including the Just Solar Coalition, which is Minneapolis-based community organizations that are doing great work on that. So there's leadership here in Minneapolis on this topic.
Thanks so much, Brad. And I think we have time for a couple more questions.
Hello, thanks. My name is Brian Hummel, and I had maybe a slightly different approach on interconnectivity. So when we're trying to connect renewables to the grid, what about connecting these projects to the community? There's a lot of agri-solar going on where we can make these solar farms and actually continue to do farming or community gardens underneath them. You had mentioned about a food desert, but also potentially projects that provide other co-benefits, like, you know, in the South, people fight over the 3 shady parking spots. You know, if you're building it over asphalt or parking lots or different areas where you're getting multiple functions out of the same product, you're getting energy, you're also getting shade, or you're getting food. We can also incorporate green infrastructure where we're helping turn flooding liabilities into biologically filtered groundwater assets. We're mitigating downstream water quality concerns and flooding concerns. So that different type of interconnectivity, if we take a more holistic view, and I'm just wondering how many people are doing that, because I haven't seen as much of that as I would like. Thank you.
Yeah, when I think of that question, I think about, yeah, I love the term used, interconnectivity. I think about, we've been using, in the terms of cost causation and beneficiary. And I think that's what you're saying, is that there's multiple benefits to solar, right? If you have host capacity that somehow correlates with parking garages that are in need, of shading or agricultural field in need of and can provide solar resource on that site, you can do that. So I think that co-beneficial, I never thought of that before, but I'm wondering if any stakeholders ever thought of, yeah, looking at just not just the grid itself and its capacity constraints and where solar can be adopted, but where it's needed and where it can provide other co-benefits. That's a really cool approach.
Yeah, so I'm not aware of any utility that currently factors that into their models, but one of the things that one of the questions that we're asking at IREC is, can you incorporate land use and other data into the distribution system planning process so that when the utility makes a determination of, oh, I want to proactively upgrade the grid in order to accommodate more distributed energy resources, that they're able to target locations like that. They don't really know where those locations are right now because that's not a question that's asked in distribution system planning. So from a planning process, I think that's a very new area. There are some DER forecasting models that include land use, but I couldn't really tell you more than that. Like, you know, how accurate is the data? What is included? I think this is a very new, very exciting emerging area.
Yep.
I recently went to a meeting in Los Angeles with the Green Buildings Council, and we were talking about distrust in the community about all the new clean energy money. And one of the solutions that the attendees had come up with is to go through the local plumbers and electricians, because those are the people who have relationships with the communities, you know, like the landlord and people that are just trying to keep their electricity on, you know, year after year in their old house, that maybe, you know, going through those individual contractors would be the best way to build that trust.
Absolutely. I think wonder if any stakeholders have ideas for other community members that should be reached out to when engaging in either these planning processes, these community engagement processes. Like, who in the community should we be reaching out to, and who have had where has effective communication been in trying to establish trust and relationships with the community?
I mean, and I know in DC, they've reached out to the churches in those communities. It's, you know, start there, start with the congregation. That's the way to build trust, and that's what I've seen. Yeah.
Can I add? So one of the questions that I think we as public interest advocates who engage in the more wonky part of the process is, what are we asking of communities when it comes to interconnection? So I think we maybe want to separate it out from how can we help get projects deployed and developed in a way that materially supports energy equity. And then the other question is, how can communities participate in the regulatory process? And with that second question, I would not be able to walk into a working group in an interconnection proceeding where it's engineers at the table. I would, you know, probably fall asleep in my chair. So, you know, it's not something that we can expect community members to do. And so, from a resources perspective and from an efficacy perspective, I think it might be helpful to all of us who are saying we want to engage with communities. What is the purpose of that engagement? Is it to support project development, or is it the regulatory process? And if it's to get more involvement in the regulatory process from a procedural equity perspective, what does that mean, and what are we asking of them?
Regina, I agree with you. The only thing I would add is one of the things we collectively, all of us, need to do better when we're talking about communities is listen to them about what they want. Because there's a problem, and I'm not trying to say you were inferring this at all, but there's a problem if any of us go to communities and try to tell them what they should want or what they should do. We just need to listen.
Absolutely. And to close this out, you know, we're nearing the end of our panel. To reference, we are, there's one more question actually. We have 2 more minutes. Yeah, we'd love to hear your question. Sorry.
Hi, my name is Rachel, and I just had a question. You know, historically, how that has always went through a process of coming into somebody's community, and doing what they need to do and benefiting from it, people in these communities want to see their people leading, not people coming in. So, like, how many tribal members are here from Minnesota? That's an example. I'm one, Maria's one. I don't know if there's anybody else, but there's a lack of knowledge, education, and participation at a higher level, not as an installer, because that's all they're teaching. We need to bring them in so they're a part of it, because that's where you're losing the trust. Because they're not going to benefit if they're not involved. Because people, that's historically, they come into the community, they do what they need, make the money they need, and leave. And then, like, I don't know how true this is, but with like the windmill, I heard that, yeah, they came in and they brought this windmill and supposed to bring energy, but nobody knows how to maintain it. Nobody was educated on that, so it sits there. And all of the instructions are not even in English. So nobody can maintain it. So that's, I think that's kind of a barrier there. So that's something to think about. And I mean, I'm coming in here knowing nothing about tariffs or any of that stuff. All I've been taught is about solar installation and the basics. But it'd be nicer to know other avenues, because that's all we're given. So that's just a thought, a food for thought for you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for bringing that to attention. We definitely have to make a better effort to reach those communities that we want them to be in the position we want you to be here. We want everyone to be here and be heard and listened to, and that their perspectives are central to the discussions and the decisions that we make. And we as IREC hope to create solutions and provide these solutions that communities can take back and learn and then produce, and we hope to continue that with all your work and all your effort. This has been a wonderful panel. Can we give a quick applause to the panel? They did a great job. Yeah, and thank you all so much. One last thing is that IREC does have a report on interconnection equity that will be taking a lot of this input and feedback. Please reach out to us and talk to us after the meeting. We'll definitely be reaching out to a lot of you to continue refining that work and making sure the recommendations are actually conducive to the communities that they're impacting. So thank you so much.